Welcome to my channel. Today I will tell you the haunting story of the Vexley School. In 1913 Wyoming, it burned without fire and left behind no ash. What if a fire could consume an entire building without leaving smoke, flame, or even the faintest trace of ash? What if walls could collapse into nothingness, desks and blackboards vanish, and children themselves be erased as though they never breathed at all? The story of the Vexley School begins with that question. For in the winter of 1913, Wyoming bore witness to something that has no name in science, no place in faith, and no explanation in law. It is remembered only in silence, a silence deeper and colder than any fire could ever leave behind. The school itself had been unremarkable in appearance. A squat brick structure that stood on the edge of a sparse town, framed by bare trees and endless fields of snow. Its roof sloped low against the prairie wind, its windows clouded with frost through long winters. Children trudged there each morning in worn boots, their laughter muffled by scarves, their cheeks red with the sting of cold air. Parents waved them off with pride, for the school was thought to be a safe house of discipline and order. It was built to last, constructed with the strong confidence of frontier determination. Nothing about it suggested fragility. Nothing suggested that within just a few years of its opening, it would cease to exist without leaving rubble, smoke, or ruin. It would be as though it had never stood at all. Yet the unease began long before that night. Some townsfolk whispered that the building carried a stillness that did not belong to wood and brick. Visitors noticed that sound seemed swallowed inside its halls. Footsteps softened, voices carried weakly, and the laughter of children never seemed to ring far. There was a sense that something hidden beneath the foundation absorbed more than just noise. It was not threatening, not at first, but disquieting, like a church after midnight or a crypt whose door is ajar. The school became a place where silence itself felt alive. The headmaster, Elias Vexley, was the image of respectability. His posture was upright, his spectacles perched neatly on the bridge of his nose, his voice calm and paternal. He spoke with the confidence of a man entrusted with shaping young minds. Townsfolk knew him as kind, disciplined, and unwavering in his dedication. To the parents, he was the perfect custodian of their children's future. To the children themselves, he was stern yet fair, a figure they both feared and trusted. Behind his composure, however, there was something colder, something that few ever glimpsed. When he was not seen walking the hallways, he would remain in his office, alone with his journals, scribbling late into the night by lamplight. He had theories he did not share, ideas no one dared to imagine. His calm was only the mask, beneath which something far more deliberate and patient resided. By the year 1913, the town had grown accustomed to small tragedies. The harsh winters took lives each year, influenza passed through in waves, and the soil sometimes yielded too little for families to survive. Yet nothing prepared them for the fate of their children. On the morning after the disappearance, when parents came to collect them, the building was still standing but empty. Doors hung open, desks perfectly arranged, chalk resting on blackboards, coats still on hooks. But no children were there. Not a sound lingered. No marks of panic, no broken glass, no footprints leading out into the snow. And then, within hours, the school itself seemed to dissolve, brick by brick, as though time moved differently within its walls. Some said they saw it crumble without noise, collapsing into a dust that never rose into the air. Others said it faded like a shadow at sunset, walls becoming pale before vanishing altogether. When the wind settled, nothing remained. No wreckage. No rubble. Only bare soil and scattered snow, as if no structure had ever been built. In the weeks that followed, investigators searched tirelessly. They probed the ground for foundations, expecting stone or charred timber. They found nothing. Not a nail, not a hinge, not a splinter of wood. The earth was smooth and cold, as though it had been scraped clean by unseen hands. Parents were forced to grieve without graves, mourning children whose bodies left no remains. It was not simply death they faced, but erasure. The cruelty of absence without proof. They would gather at night in their kitchens, lamps glowing dim, and whisper the same question over and over. How can a building burn with no fire, and how can ash itself refuse to exist? Some townsfolk believed it was divine punishment, that God had marked the school for reasons no man could understand. Others feared it was the work of spirits, restless souls from the frontier past reclaiming what was theirs. But there were those who suspected something more human, something that walked among them unnoticed. They remembered Elias Vexley, his calm, his silence, his patience, and the way his eyes lingered just a second too long when children recited their lessons. He vanished with the building, his body never found. Some whispered he had taken the children into the earth itself, swallowed them with the school in one final ritual. His journals were never recovered. His name was spoken less and less with each year, until the memory of him became only a bitter taste left in the mouths of the oldest townsfolk. And so the story of the Vexley School slipped from the records. Official documents were destroyed, maps erased its location, and officials gave no answers. The silence of that place was carried into silence of the people who survived it. Generations later, when the land was turned over and new buildings raised nearby, workers claimed that at certain hours, when the wind was sharp and the ground frozen, they could still hear faint sounds beneath their feet. Not screams, not laughter, but the muffled rhythm of children reciting lessons in unison, their voices swallowed in the soil. As quickly as they came, the sounds would fade, leaving only the chill of dread. The fire that left no flame, the ash that never fell, and the children who never returned, all of it hangs like a question without answer. What if a place can vanish because someone wished it to vanish, not through destruction but through erasure? What if silence itself could be sharpened into a weapon more complete than fire? The story of the Vexley School begins here, with questions no one dares ask out loud, questions that carry the weight of fear even a century later. And it does not end with the school's disappearance, for the silence it left still echoes, still unsettles, and still demands to be told. Elias Vexley carried himself with a dignity that silenced rooms before he spoke. He was a tall man, though not imposing, his frame softened by age and a scholar's posture bent slightly forward as if leaning always toward a book. His eyes were pale, gentle in their first impression, though if one stared long enough there was something unnerving behind them, like a lantern set too deep inside a well. Parents described him as fatherly, trustworthy, a man devoted to discipline and structure. He wore modest suits, polished shoes, and never raised his voice. In town he was greeted with warmth, and his reputation was free of blemish. He led Sunday lessons when asked, carried groceries for widows, and offered advice to farmers struggling with debt. To everyone around him, Elias Vexley was a quiet pillar of order, an educated man who had chosen to shepherd children rather than pursue wealth or politics. He appeared to be a gift to the community, but the truth of his mind was a truth no one could have spoken aloud. For beneath that calm, Elias carried a hunger disguised as thoughtfulness. His journals, never meant to be seen, revealed a philosophy he had cultivated since his youth. In careful handwriting, he recorded ideas about purity, about innocence, about the ways in which children were not merely learners but vessels. He wrote of their laughter as a resource, their breath as a material, their blood as a hidden script of the soul. He believed that innocence was not a trait but a substance, something that could be collected, separated, and preserved if handled correctly. He called it the white marrow, the silent essence of youth. Fire, in his mind, was too crude and destructive to reveal it. Fire reduced everything to ash. He wanted a process that left nothing wasted, no visible trace, only the refined extraction of what he imagined was the hidden core of purity. To him that was not murder. It was purification. By day he drilled children in arithmetic and letters, his tone measured, his smile patient. He encouraged recitation in perfect unison, the sound of many voices merging into one. He praised order, he praised silence, and he seemed almost proudest when a room of children sat completely still, as if they were not children at all but instruments awaiting his command. What no one knew was that these sessions were rehearsals in his mind. He was testing their ability to surrender individuality, to give themselves over to structure, because he believed that was the first step toward releasing what he sought. When the voices blended, he thought he could almost hear something else, something deeper behind the sound, as if the children's combined innocence was pressing against the walls, begging to be freed. He would go home after such lessons and write furiously in his journal, convinced that he was closer to understanding the method of extraction. At night he would sit alone in his office, the lamps turned low, his spectacles catching faint glimmers as he bent over the desk. He charted diagrams of human figures, not in the grotesque style of butchers, but in the neat precision of a scholar. He noted where breath expanded in the lungs, where silence pooled in the chest, how stillness seemed to settle in the bones. He was searching for entry points, places where what he called the white marrow might escape without violence, without chaos, without the vulgar stains of ordinary death. He devised instruments in his mind, desks with hollow chambers, ink wells that concealed more than ink, chalk that carried ground remnants of things unspoken. To the outsider it might have read like madness, but to Elias it was science married to devotion, a ritual guided by exacting reason. He saw himself as a custodian not of education, but of transformation. What made Elias most dangerous was not rage or passion, but patience. He was not driven by impulse. He waited, he tested, he refined. He never harmed animals in crude experiments, never left behind obvious traces of cruelty. He believed his work required restraint. Children had to trust him, parents had to revere him, society had to sleep while he worked. He hid in plain sight, wrapping his obsession in a mask of kindness so perfect that even suspicion would wither beneath it. He told himself that true evil was loud, chaotic, and clumsy. His path was not evil in his eyes. It was quiet, disciplined, necessary. In silence he believed he was serving something higher than himself. That conviction was what made him inhuman. The children never saw the shadow behind his spectacles. They knew only the warmth of his voice when he told them to sit straighter, to breathe evenly, to recite their lessons with pride. They laughed at recess, unaware that he was watching their games not with affection, but with calculation. He measured the pitch of their voices, the rhythm of their skipping, the force of their lungs when they shouted. He was listening for patterns, convinced that innocence had a sound, a frequency like a hidden note woven into their play. He believed that if he could capture that sound, he could harness purity itself. When a child laughed too freely, his eyes would narrow almost imperceptibly, as though the sound was too precious to waste on the air. He wanted it bottled, preserved, transfigured into silence. In his journals he wrote that innocence was combustible, but not with flame. It burned in silence, leaving no smoke. He imagined it as a pale fire, one that consumed without residue, one that erased rather than destroyed. He wrote of creating conditions where children's essence could be stripped away without screams, without scars, leaving nothing but absence. This was his vision of purification, a ritual of fireless burning, a school turned not into a place of learning, but into an instrument of erasure. He cloaked this in theological language at times, describing himself as a priest of silence, though he never spoke of God. To him, silence was God enough. The town saw none of this. They saw a man who never married, but who gave his life to their children. They saw someone who kept orderly records, who polished the school bell, who walked the corridors with hands folded behind his back like a caretaker of souls. They saw devotion, not obsession. And because they wanted to believe in him, because they needed to trust someone with their most vulnerable, they never asked what it meant that his office door was always locked at night, or that he burned paper often in a small iron stove, the smoke barely curling out into the winter sky. They did not ask why his eyes lingered on children's breath as they exhaled into the cold, watching the vapor with an intensity that unsettled anyone who caught his gaze. They turned away, dismissing it as eccentricity. No one asked what he was collecting in silence. But Elias Vexley's thoughts did not rest. Each night he grew more convinced that his school was not simply a building but an altar. Its walls contained the silence he needed, its classrooms provided the order he required, and its children, their laughter, their breath, their fleeting innocence, were the raw material of his ritual. He had built more than lessons. He had built a vessel. In his mind, it was not a place of education but of extraction, and he alone held the knowledge to unlock what no one else could see. He believed the world would thank him one day for cleansing it of wasted innocence, for refining it into silence that endured. To him this was not cruelty. It was completion. The quiet schoolmaster who walked the halls with calm authority, who bowed his head politely in church, who offered his hand to widows and spoke with measured grace, was no man of kindness at all. He was a patient architect of erasure, methodical in thought, restrained in action, but burning with a belief that made him unstoppable. He hid behind warmth, but inside he carried a furnace colder than any fire, a furnace that consumed not with flame but with silence. And in the stillness of his mind, Elias Vexley had already decided that one day, the entire school would burn without fire, and nothing, no child, no wall, no memory, would leave ash behind. The disappearances began without alarm. At first they were single names, small absences written on the attendance ledger in Vexley's precise hand. A boy missing from his seat, a girl absent from morning recitation. Parents were told they had run away, perhaps seeking relatives in other towns, perhaps fleeing poverty with reckless hope. In that era, such explanations were easy to accept, for the frontier was harsh, and children sometimes vanished into its empty distances. But beneath the calm reports and Vexley's quiet assurances, something else was unfolding. Each child who vanished had not left into the world. They had been folded into silence itself, their voices extinguished by the very man entrusted to protect them. Vexley had perfected his method slowly, carefully, so no one would notice. He had designed desks that appeared ordinary, polished wood with compartments for books and ink. But beneath the surface, hidden panels led into hollow chambers, small enough to restrain, tight enough to compress. When tested, the sound within those chambers could not carry beyond the wood. Once a child was sealed inside, the room beyond heard nothing. No struggle, no scream. It was as if the desk itself swallowed their existence. He called them his silent coffins, though in his journals he described them with sterile precision, as if cataloging instruments of science rather than containers of flesh. To him they were tools of extraction, the first phase of his experiment. The children who disappeared this way were not killed instantly. Vexley believed that purity was most potent at the threshold between life and silence. He forced them into stillness, pressing their lungs against the wood, watching their small hands claw briefly at air before weakening. He timed the moments, measured the intervals, noting how long it took before breath ceased. The silence that followed was, in his view, a harvest. He claimed in his journals that the absence left behind was not emptiness but residue, the invisible echo of innocence compressed until it no longer made sound. He would sit in the empty classroom afterward, listening not to screams but to the way silence itself seemed denser, heavier, more complete. He convinced himself this was proof that the white marrow had been released, that he had captured something invisible to the rest of the world. The town grew uneasy as the absences accumulated, yet Vexley's composure disarmed suspicion. He expressed concern, organized searches, walked with grieving parents through fields as if he too feared the worst. His calm was persuasive, his role as headmaster unshakable. Who would accuse the very man trusted to teach their children? He used the town's faith as cover, moving carefully, ensuring that no more than one or two vanished at a time, never enough to cause panic at once. His cruelty was slow-burning, methodical, spread over weeks so that suspicion fractured before it could take shape. The community turned its blame inward, toward poverty, toward harsh winters, toward the mysterious wanderings of youth. Vexley allowed them to believe it, nurturing their despair like a gardener tending soil. It kept him safe, it kept him invisible, and it gave him time to refine his work. Inside his office, his journals grew darker. He wrote of silence as a living thing, an organism he was feeding with breath and stillness. He described the children not as victims but as offerings, their innocence dissolved into the air around him. He would sit in the classrooms at night, when the moonlight crept across the blackboards, and breathe deeply as if inhaling something more than air. He believed he could feel their presence within him, not as voices but as weight pressing on his lungs, as if the silence he had harvested had substance. He convinced himself he was being transformed by it, cleansed, purified, elevated into a state beyond ordinary men. The children in his mind had not been destroyed. They had been distilled into him. The desks became his altar. He polished them each morning, ensuring no sign of struggle remained, no scratch of fingernails to betray what had occurred. He replaced inkwells and chalk as if nothing had happened. When parents visited, he invited them to sit at those very desks, letting their hands rest where silence had already claimed lives. They thanked him for his dedication, never knowing they were touching instruments of erasure. This duplicity thrilled him. The ordinary and the horrific lived side by side in plain sight, and he alone knew the truth. It gave him a sense of mastery not only over the children but over the entire community. They were blind because he willed them blind. But Vexley's hunger grew. The hollow desks were effective, but they were limited. Each child required a separate act, a separate concealment, a separate disappearance. He began imagining something larger, more encompassing, a ritual that could transform silence not child by child but in unison. He longed to hear an entire classroom fall silent at once, not through discipline, not through instruction, but through extinguishing breath together, a chorus cut off in the same instant. He believed this would release a magnitude of purity beyond anything he had touched before. The desks, then, were only rehearsal, preparation for a performance that would one day encompass the entire school. His journals spoke of that dream in the same measured handwriting he used for lesson plans, each word neat and deliberate, as though planning an exam rather than imagining mass erasure. The teachers under him saw nothing. They assumed the missing children were tragedies of poverty, of broken homes, of chance. They carried on with classes, comforting those who remained. And yet those who remained began to change. The children sensed something they could not name. They noticed that silence in the classroom felt heavier, that laughter died quickly in the air, that their own voices sounded duller when they recited lessons. Some whispered at night in the dormitories that the school itself was swallowing sound. They dared not say it aloud to adults for fear of being punished or dismissed. But in their hearts they carried dread, though none of them could see the figure behind it. Elias Vexley smiled at them each morning, his eyes calm, his voice steady. He reassured them with warmth, and they obeyed, never realizing that obedience itself was their undoing. The parents who lost children carried grief like stones. They asked questions, searched the fields, prayed in churches. But grief made them easy to control. Vexley's reassurances offered structure when chaos threatened to break them. He told them it was fate, misfortune, wandering blood. He walked with them in sorrow, his hands clasped, his head bowed. And in those gestures he secured their trust even further. He had built a prison of silence around them, and none could see its bars. His cruelty was not only in what he did to the children, but in how he manipulated those left behind to accept what could never be accepted. He left them with empty beds, empty chairs, empty arms, and silence. Elias Vexley had begun his work. The hollow desks were only the beginning. He had tasted the weight of silence, he had felt innocence dissolve, and he hungered for more. The lessons of stillness, of soundlessness, of voices cut short, became the foundation for something greater. And as winter deepened in Wyoming, the headmaster's dreams turned darker still. He began to write of rituals without fire, of dissolutions without smoke, of endings that left no ash. What had begun as isolated vanishings was moving toward something vast. And in the mind of Elias Vexley, the quiet schoolmaster, the path forward was clear. The school itself would one day be his altar, and every child within it an offering to silence. Elias Vexley's obsession was no longer satisfied by silence alone. The hollow desks had given him proof that innocence could be swallowed without trace, but he wanted refinement. He no longer believed that erasure was enough. He wanted transformation. The school had to become more than a place where sound was stilled. It had to become a chamber where matter itself was unmade, where flesh and memory dissolved into something pure. In his journals he wrote that fire was crude, too loud, too visible. He desired a flame that left no soot, a combustion without heat, a ritual that consumed while leaving the world above unmarked. He began to call it the unseen fire. The first experiments were hidden in plain sight. Inkwells placed on desks contained not only ink but a mixture of his own design. He had studied the properties of acids, solvents, and rare minerals ordered through catalogs under the guise of educational supplies. What he created was not immediate corrosion, but a solution that thinned flesh into vapor when applied with patience. He would test drops on scraps of animal tissue smuggled in from butchers, recording the time it took for skin to vanish. But soon animals were not enough. He waited for children's small cuts and scrapes, offering to treat them with unusual care. He would dip a cloth in the mixture and watch as the wound puckered strangely, leaving no scar, as if the skin itself had been rewritten. The children felt only a sting, unaware that they were subjects in a test. Vexley watched with fascination, believing he had found a method by which flesh could be removed from the world without leaving a trace. But he wanted more than wounds. He wanted dissolution. At night he carried buckets of the mixture into the cellar, where discarded wood, broken desks, and scraps of refuse were placed. He poured carefully, timing the reaction, watching as solid forms melted into vapor, rising and then dispersing into the air without smoke. He described it as fire turned inside out, a combustion without flame, a reversal of nature's order. And as he watched wood and stone vanish, he imagined children reduced in the same way, bodies unmade until no evidence remained. To him this was not destruction. It was purification, the true unveiling of innocence released into the ether. His journals grew meticulous. He measured quantities down to drops, temperatures down to single degrees. He recorded not only the physical changes but the atmosphere of the room, the way the air seemed to thicken, the way silence deepened after each experiment. He believed the solution did not merely dissolve matter, but transfigured it into silence itself, feeding the unseen organism he had described in earlier entries. He began to carry small vials of the mixture in his pockets, stroking them like relics. To others they were bottles of ink. To him they were vessels of fireless flame, portable altars waiting for their moment. The chalkboards too became part of his ritual. He began grinding bone fragments into powder, mixing them into chalk sticks that teachers used each morning. None suspected their source. To write with them was to smear the remains of silence onto boards, to fill the classroom with ghostly residue. Vexley watched as words appeared on the boards, convinced that the children were learning lessons written in death itself. He saw it as binding the erased into education, ensuring their innocence lived on not in graves but in letters and numbers. Parents praised the children's progress, never realizing that every calculation, every phrase, was traced from the dust of vanished flesh. The ritual was not confined to the cellar now. It was woven into the daily rhythm of the school. Vexley's methods became increasingly symbolic. He spoke in his journals of transubstantiation, though not in Christian terms. To him, bread and wine were poor substitutes for what could truly be transformed. He wanted the school itself to eat what was erased. He wanted desks, chalkboards, and floors to become vessels, absorbing the children he offered. He experimented with candles that burned cold, flames tinted pale by strange powders, convinced they were rehearsals for a greater unseen fire. He would light them in his office, let them flicker over his journals, and stare at the shadows until they seemed to bend in silence. He believed he could see faces in those shadows, the outlines of children already dissolved, watching him from behind the veil. Instead of fear, he felt pride. He thought himself chosen, guided by something higher than law or morality. The cruelty of his methods lay not only in their physical horror but in their design. He built systems where children became both subject and symbol, where their bodies fed rituals disguised as education. When a child dipped a pen into an inkwell, they touched the liquid meant to dissolve them. When they wrote on chalkboards, their hands pressed remnants of those already vanished. When they recited lessons in silence, their breath mingled with air thickened by what had been erased below. Every moment of their school life was entwined with Vexley's obsession, though they never knew it. He had transformed the ordinary into a stage for his unseen flame, and they were both actors and sacrifices in a play they could not see. By the winter of 1913, Vexley's confidence had grown into certainty. He no longer doubted his methods. He had tested enough, hidden enough, perfected enough. His journals spoke of culmination, of the moment when silence and unseen fire would merge to consume not one child at a time, but all at once. He dreamed of a night when every desk, every board, every wall would ignite without flame, erasing the entire building and its children in a single act of silent combustion. To him it was not destruction but ascension. He wrote of it with reverence as if describing a holy day. He gave it a name, the ashless fire. The town still saw nothing. They saw their children learning, their teachers working, their headmaster steady and calm. They saw Vexley walking home each evening, coat buttoned, lamp carried carefully, nodding politely at neighbors. They saw normalcy because they wanted to. They did not see the basement barrels, the powdered bones and chalk, the vials of fireless flame hidden in his pockets. They did not hear the silence he had cultivated, did not feel the weight of the air thickened by erasure. They trusted him because he gave them no reason not to. And trust was his most perfect disguise. Yet silence has a way of pressing outward. Some children began whispering of strange smells in the classrooms, faint chemical scents that made their throats burn. Others claimed to see chalk dust shimmer faintly in sunlight, as though carrying colors not meant for the eye. They noticed that the air in the school felt different than in their homes, heavier, harder to breathe. But children's voices carried no authority. When they told parents, they were dismissed as fanciful or fearful. And so the truth remained hidden, growing stronger each day beneath the calm exterior of routine. Elias Vexley had built his rituals, had hidden them inside ink and chalk, inside wood and stone, inside silence itself. He believed the unseen fire was ready, that the school itself had become one vast altar waiting for its final offering. The desks were no longer just coffins, the chalk no longer just dust. Everything was prepared for the culmination, for the moment when walls, children, and air would dissolve into nothingness together. And as he polished his spectacles each night, as he locked his journals away and extinguished his pale candles, he knew with certainty that soon the school would burn without fire and no ash would remain. The night of culmination arrived without warning, wrapped in the silence of winter. Snow had fallen throughout the day, blanketing Wyoming in a heavy stillness that muted every sound. The air was brittle, sharp against the lungs, and the town settled into its familiar rhythm of oil lamps glowing in windows and smoke curling lazily from chimneys. To most, it was an ordinary evening, but to Elias Vexley it was the moment he had been preparing for since the school first opened its doors. His journals described it not as an act but as a ceremony, one that would cleanse, purify, and release. He believed the ashless fire had ripened within the walls, and that the school was ready to vanish in a single, silent exhalation. The children had been gathered earlier that evening for what Vexley called a special lesson. He told them their diligence deserved recognition, that they would receive a night of instruction unlike any other. Tired from the day, they followed obediently, their small boots trailing wet prints across the wooden floors. The teachers, weary but trusting, allowed Vexley his indulgence, for he was headmaster and his word was final. None could imagine what waited within his plan. The classrooms were lit with pale candles, their flames unnaturally cool, tinted by powders Vexley had perfected. Shadows bent strangely on the walls, stretching longer than their sources, as if the air itself resisted the light. The children sat at their desks, whispering nervously, but Vexley calmed them with his steady voice, promising they would witness something sacred. They believed him because belief was all they had ever been taught. Beneath the floorboards, the cellar had been prepared with meticulous care. Barrels of his dissolving mixture lined the walls, lids removed, vapors seeping upward into the rooms above. The chemicals were chosen not for their violence but for their subtlety. They did not choke or burn. They simply thinned, unraveling matter into vapor. Above them, chalkboards bore words written with dust ground from bones of those already erased, symbols of repetition that marked the rhythm of the ritual. Desks, once instruments of isolated silence, had been arranged in precise symmetry, forming a pattern invisible to the children but clear to Vexley. The school itself had become a single machine, each piece an organ in a body prepared for sacrifice. The lesson began with recitation. Vexley instructed the children to speak their lessons in unison, voices rising and falling like a chant. He measured their rhythm with small nods of his head, adjusting them until they spoke as one, no child distinct from another. Their voices merged into a single sound, steady, resonant, filling the room with a cadence that seemed endless. Vexley closed his eyes, savoring it, for to him this was the sound of innocence loosening its grip, pressing against the walls, ready to be released. He recorded later in his journals that the air itself trembled, that silence pressed in from the edges of the room like water against glass. To him, the ritual was working. The unseen fire had been lit. When the moment was right, he signaled for the children to inhale deeply, to hold their breath, and to release in perfect unison. The exhalation rolled through the room like a soft wind, yet the sound was strangely muffled, as though swallowed by something beneath the floor. The candles flickered, flames bending low without smoke. The desks trembled faintly, their hollow cores resonating like drums. Then, without violence, the transformation began. The children's voices faded mid-syllable, not trailing into silence but vanishing as though cut from existence. Their eyes widened, mouths open, yet no sound came. Their bodies stiffened, not from fear but from some unseen force stripping them of motion. The air grew heavy, thick, impossible to draw into lungs. In moments, rows of children sat frozen, their forms wavering faintly as if dissolving from the edges inward. Vexley watched, calm, almost serene, as they were erased before his eyes. There was no panic, no screaming, no chaos. The ritual denied such noise. One by one, the children dimmed, their outlines fading into pale translucence until nothing remained but empty desks. Coats still hung on hooks, shoes rested neatly under chairs, slates lay on desktops, but the children themselves were gone. The classroom was intact, but hollow, stripped of life in a way that left no proof of struggle. To those who might enter later, it would appear they had never been there at all. Vexley stood in the stillness, arms folded, eyes closed, breathing deeply as though inhaling the residue of what had been released. In his mind, the silence was not emptiness but abundance, filled with the essence of every child erased. He believed he had succeeded beyond his greatest visions. But the ritual did not stop with one classroom. The vapor rising from the cellar thickened, spreading into every corridor, seeping beneath every door. Other classrooms, other children were caught in the same unfolding. Teachers tried to move, to shout, but their voices too were swallowed mid-breath, their limbs stiffening as the unseen fire consumed them. Some collapsed onto desks, their forms evaporating into thin air, leaving no bodies behind. The chalk on the boards glowed faintly, symbols smearing themselves as if written by invisible hands. The candles guttered without smoke. The air grew impossibly still, a silence so complete that it pressed into the ears like weight. The entire building had been transformed into one vast chamber of erasure. Neighbors later claimed they saw the school shimmer faintly in the night, its edges blurred, its roofline wavering as though heat rose from it despite the snow. Some swore the walls paled before their eyes, brick by brick losing solidity. Yet no sound carried on the wind. No screams. No collapse. Only silence. Within hours, the structure itself seemed to dissolve, as though the unseen fire Vexley had cultivated consumed not just the children but the building that housed them. When morning came, nothing remained but a flat patch of frozen earth, smooth as if scraped clean by an invisible hand. No rubble, no splinter, no ash. Only emptiness. Vexley himself was never seen again. Whether he dissolved with his creation or fled into the silence he had birthed, no one knew. Some believed he had transcended into the realm he imagined, his body unmade along with his victims. Others whispered he walked away that night, carrying silence within him, unseen in the snow. His journals were never recovered, though some claimed fragments surfaced decades later, smuggled into archives too disturbing for public eyes. What mattered to the town was that their children were gone, their school erased, and their faith shattered. They had trusted him completely, and in that trust he had perfected his ritual. The night the school vanished became legend, yet the silence it left was not legend but fact. Parents searched the barren ground with trembling hands, desperate for even a scrap of cloth, a lock of hair, something to bury. They found nothing. Officials came, scribbled reports, and left their explanations hollow. Some said the building had burned in a chemical accident, though there were no flames, no smoke, no debris. Others claimed it was swallowed by the earth, though the ground showed no sign of collapse. In truth, no one dared write what had happened. They feared that naming it might summon it again. And so the silence was sealed, just as Vexley had always intended. The school had vanished, and with it hundreds of lives, leaving the town paralyzed in grief. But the silence did not fade. It lingered in the soil, in the air, in the memory of those who survived. And in that silence was the echo of Vexley's unseen fire, a ritual that had proven more complete than death itself. When the sun rose on the morning after the disappearance, the town gathered at the edge of the frozen earth where the school had once stood. The snow there was strangely smooth, as if ironed flat by invisible hands. Parents searched desperately, clawing at the ground with numb fingers, praying to find even the smallest trace. They found no brick, no splinter of wood, no scrap of cloth. The hooks where coats had once hung were gone, the blackboards erased, the desks vanished into nothing. It was as if an entire building had been lifted from the world and erased from memory, save for the unbearable emptiness it left behind. Mothers screamed into the silence, their voices breaking, but the silence did not answer. It pressed back against them, heavy and cruel, sealing the loss as if it belonged to some higher order of law. Officials arrived within days, summoned by frantic telegrams. They walked the grounds with stiff posture and pale faces, whispering theories that sounded hollow even as they were spoken. Some speculated a collapse, yet the ground bore no fracture. Others muttered of fire, yet there was no ash, no char, no smoke in the sky. A few whispered chemical accident, but what accident leaves nothing? Their pens moved quickly, their reports filled with words that explained nothing, a ritual of paperwork designed to hide ignorance. They asked parents to stop their wailing, to go home, to trust that answers would come. But answers never did. The silence of the site became an unhealed wound, raw and bleeding, that the community was forced to carry alone. Elias Vexley's absence was noted, but not confronted. His name was written into reports, then carefully crossed out. Officials spoke of him rarely, and when they did, their voices carried unease. Some insisted he had perished with the building, his body erased with the children. Others believed he had fled into the snow, carrying his secrets with him. The truth was that no one dared say aloud what many feared, that he had orchestrated the vanishing, that the man trusted to guard innocence had instead consumed it. To admit that would have been to admit that evil can live behind a smile, that kindness can be a mask. And so silence protected him even after he was gone. Yet whispers persisted. Some parents swore they saw strange marks in the soil at night, faint diagrams burned into the earth when the moonlight struck just right. Circles, lines, symbols that meant nothing to them but carried a dreadful weight. Others claimed to hear faint voices beneath the ground, children reciting lessons in unison, their tones flat and hollow, echoing upward through frozen soil. The farmers who plowed nearby swore their horses refused to pass the field, pulling hard at reins, eyes wide with panic. The ground itself seemed to remember even if no one dared speak it. The silence was not empty. It was alive. Years passed and the site was left untouched. The town built no new structure there, planted no crops, drove no roads. It became a scar, an open space in the middle of life that no one entered. Children were told never to play near it, though sometimes they dared, creeping close enough to feel the unnatural cold that seemed to linger even in summer. They said the ground hummed faintly, like a low breath held beneath the soil. They ran home pale and trembling, carrying stories their parents dismissed but never forgot. The silence remained unbroken, as though the earth itself had sealed what Vexley had done. Decades later, fragments surfaced. In the archives of a distant county, a box of papers was found mislabeled under routine school reports. Inside were pages of Elias Vexley's journals, their ink faded but still legible. They were not complete, but what remained was enough to chill the blood of anyone who read them. He wrote of innocence as a substance, of silence as a living organism, of purification through unseen fire. He described children not as students but as offerings, their breath harvested, their laughter preserved in air, their flesh dissolved without trace. His diagrams showed hollow desks, inkwells of acid, chalk made from bone. And in careful, clinical language, he described the culmination, the night when silence itself would consume the building, leaving nothing but absence. To those who studied the pages, it was not madness. It was method, written with discipline, with patience, with the coldness of a man who believed he was chosen. The discovery was never made public. Officials sealed the box, marked it confidential, and buried it in government vaults. They feared panic, scandal, the unraveling of trust. Better, they believed, to let the silence remain unbroken. But whispers spread among archivists, among clerks, among the few who had seen the words with their own eyes. They told friends in hushed tones, and those friends carried the stories further. Soon the town itself heard the rumors, though never through official channels. They learned that Vexley had left writings, that his calm exterior had hidden something unspeakable. The whispers became part of the soil's legend, merging with the stories already told of voices beneath the earth. The silence was fed not only by memory but by fear. Generations later, when construction crews were ordered to raise new structures near the site, their work was brief. Foundations laid near the field cracked within days, their stones splitting without cause. Machinery stalled inexplicably, metal rusting in hours. Workers reported dizziness, sudden nosebleeds, whispers in their ears when no one was near. One man swore he heard his own child's voice calling from beneath the ground, though his child slept safely at home. The site was abandoned again, fenced off, marked as unstable. Locals laughed nervously when speaking of it, calling it cursed, though beneath the laughter was dread. No one dared stay near it after dark. The silence was not simply remembered, it was active waiting. Some believed the silence was Vexley himself, his essence merged with what he had created. They said he had not died but had been absorbed, living within the ashless fire he had birthed. Others thought the children's innocence, stripped and preserved, had fused into the soil, creating a presence that could never rest. The truth did not matter. What mattered was that the ground itself carried a weight that no one could deny. It was not haunted in the ordinary sense. It was erased, yet alive, an absence that refused to fade. For the families who had lost children, time did not heal. They grew old without graves to visit, without names etched in stone. They carried the silence within them until death, their grief unspoken because there was nothing to speak to. The silence became inheritance, passed from parent to child, carried in hushed warnings and uneasy glances toward the barren field. Even those born long after the vanishing felt its shadow. They grew up with stories of a school that had burned without fire, of children swallowed without ash, of a headmaster who smiled while planning erasure. The whispers shaped their lives, teaching them that trust could be betrayal, that innocence could be consumed by those who wore masks of kindness. The soil of Wyoming carried the silence of Vexley's ritual, and though the building was gone, though the children were unmade, the memory could not be erased. Silence itself became the monument, the scar that endured when all else had vanished. And as decades passed and whispers traveled and fragments of journals surfaced in secret, one truth remained certain. The Vexley School had not been destroyed by accident. It had been consumed deliberately, methodically, ritualistically, leaving behind no ash, no sound, only the terrible weight of silence that the world dared not name. The silence left by the disappearance of the Vexley School did not remain only in Wyoming. It spread outward, not in sound or record but in absence. Families scattered, many leaving the town entirely, unable to bear the sight of the barren field where the school had once stood. Those who remained lived with grief that could not be named, mourning children whose bodies had left no trace. Without graves, funerals were hollow rituals, words spoken into the air with no earth to receive them. Mothers clutched photographs, fathers stared at empty chairs, siblings grew up with shadows instead of companions. The silence that had been cultivated within the school seeped into every home, a presence heavier than any voice could overcome. Officials tried to smother the story. Reports were rewritten, files sealed, and language softened into euphemisms that concealed more than they revealed. The word accident appeared in documents, though no accident was described. The word fire was used, though no flame was witnessed. Those who signed the papers knew they were participating in a lie, but the alternative was to admit something unthinkable, that a man entrusted with children had built a machine of erasure, and that the state had failed to see it. Governments feared scandal, feared the collapse of trust, feared the questions it would unleash about every other institution. And so the silence became not only Vexley's ritual, but society's defense. The disappearance of the school was locked away behind bureaucratic doors, hidden beneath official language, buried alongside other inconvenient horrors history prefers not to remember. Yet silence does not erase. It lingers. It waits. Generations after the vanishing, fragments of the truth began to resurface in strange ways. A researcher in the 1940s uncovered a thin folder mislabeled in a regional archive. Inside were copies of Vexley's letters to suppliers, ordering chemicals under the pretense of educational experiments. His tone was polite, professional, and ordinary. Only when cross-referenced with his journals did their significance become clear. These chemicals were the ingredients of the unseen fire. The folder was quietly resealed, the discovery buried once more. In the 1960s, a farmer digging irrigation trenches near the site found glass shards unlike any others, faintly etched with children's handwriting, as though breath itself had been trapped inside and cooled into solid form. Scientists who examined them could not explain their origin. The shards were taken, labeled, and stored, then forgotten. Each generation brushed against the truth, but never dared to face it fully. The town itself changed. It learned to live beside the scar, but never to embrace it. The field where the school had stood became a forbidden place, fenced off with barbed wire. No one claimed ownership, though deeds still listed the land. No crops were planted there, no buildings raised, no celebrations held. It became a memorial without inscription, a graveyard without stones. Children growing up in the town were warned never to wander near it, though some dared each year, testing courage. They returned pale and shaken, swearing the air grew heavier near the soil, that whispers followed them, that laughter echoed faintly beneath their feet. They could never prove it, but their fear was proof enough. The silence remained alive, as if Vexley's ritual had not ended with the school but had fused itself into the land. In the late 20th century, local historians began to push against the silence. They argued for recognition, for acknowledgement of what had happened. They wrote articles in small journals, gave lectures in libraries, and begged for official inquiry. Some advocated for a memorial, a stone inscribed with the names of the lost children. But there were no names to give, for the records had been destroyed. Attendance sheets, family registers, birth certificates, all had been lost in the purge of evidence. Without names, a memorial seemed hollow. And yet silence was worse. In 1983, a small group of residents erected a stone at the edge of the field. It bore no inscription, no date, no words, only a blank surface. They said it was fitting, for the children had left no bodies, no graves, no ash. The blankness was their memory, absence carved into stone. Visitors left flowers there, though no one spoke aloud whose memory they honored. It became a ritual of grief without language. But the silence could not prevent questions. Scholars who studied institutional cruelty began to cite the Vexley case as an example of what evil looks like when hidden behind normalcy. They pointed to his calm demeanor, his role as a caretaker, his mask of fatherly warmth. They argued that his crime was not simply in what he did, but in how he appeared ordinary while doing it. Evil, they warned, is not always loud or monstrous. Often it is quiet, patient, methodical. Often it hides in uniforms, in offices, in classrooms. The Vexley School became a symbol not just of one man's obsession, but of society's blindness. Trust had become complicity, silence had become protection, and by the time the truth could be seen, it was too late. For survivors, the silence never lifted. Children who had not attended the school carried guilt for having lived while others vanished. Parents aged into bitterness, their faith shattered. Siblings grew into adults who never stopped wondering where their brothers or sisters had gone, imagining them dissolved into air, absorbed into soil, trapped forever in an unseen flame. Some moved far away, yet even in distant cities the silence followed. It was not bound to the field alone. It was carried in memory, in blood, in whispers passed from parent to child. The legacy of Vexley was not only erasure but inheritance. Each generation learned to live with what could not be spoken. By the 21st century, the field had become both legend and warning. Travelers came to see it, curious about the story of a school that had burned without fire and left no ash. Some scoffed at the supernatural explanations, dismissing it as folklore. But those who stood on the soil often found themselves unnerved. They spoke of headaches, of strange ringing in the ears, of sudden waves of grief for reasons they could not explain. They left quickly, shaken by something they could not name. The silence was not history. It was present, active, a force that reached into the living even as it devoured the past. What remained undeniable was the pattern. Elias Vexley had proven something terrifying, that erasure can be more complete than death. Fire leaves ash, graves leave stones, even ruins testify to loss. But absence leaves nothing. It denies even the comfort of mourning. It makes memory fragile, vulnerable to time and silence. That was his true cruelty. He had not only killed children. He had denied them remembrance. He had robbed their families of grief itself, replacing it with emptiness that could not be filled. In this, he revealed the most chilling truth about evil, that it does not always seek to destroy but to erase. And yet, even in erasure, memory survives. The blank stone at the edge of the field, the whispers in the soil, the fragments of journals, these are resistance against silence. They are fragile, incomplete, uncertain, but they endure. They testify not to what happened fully, but to the fact that something happened, something too terrible to name. In that way, the children are remembered even without names, even without graves. Their legacy is the silence that unsettles, the blankness that cannot be ignored. And perhaps that is fitting, for what Vexley created was not fire but ashless absence, and what remains is the refusal of that absence to fade. As the faceless narrator of history, we are left with questions. How many evils have been hidden behind kindness? How many institutions have concealed cruelty behind order? How many figures like Elias Vexley have walked among us, smiling, polite, respected, while building machines of silence beneath our trust? The story of the Vexley School is not only a tragedy of one town, one year, one headmaster. It is a warning that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it erases. Today, when one stands at the barren field, the silence is still heavy. The wind moves across it, but the air feels denser there, as if holding breath it cannot release. The blank stone waits, offering no words, only reflection. And in that reflection lies the final lesson. Evil does not end when the act ends. It endures in silence, in memory, in the inheritance of grief. Elias Vexley is gone, but the silence he made remains. It is the monument, the legacy, the warning. What do you think? Could it happen again? Could silence consume once more, hidden behind the calm mask of normalcy? The answer may be closer than we wish to believe. For silence is patient, and silence waits.